it's easy at this juncture of the biblical theology to get a bit bogged down if you're not careful and to miss the very stimulating discussion that is underway. Let me try to frame it. The critics have argued in previous episodes that the law is something that can be obeyed without any kind of redemptive approach from the Lord. They've taken a view that we termed earlier a pure covenant of works, republished with Israel, where sinners, devoid of any kind of grace, can do what is pleasing to God. And I want to tie that just by way of introduction to our OPC report and just remind us of a taxonomic overview here. The critics have argued that there is a covenant their language isn't the covenant of works, but their argument is that sinners apart from grace can render obedience pleasing to the Lord. That's going to play into this section because in this section, the critics are going to try to argue that God can be pleased under the Mosaic covenant apart from redemptive sacrifice, apart from substitutionary sacrifice on behalf of the sinner. But more broadly, and I just want our listeners to remember this, Voss is arguing contra the critical view that the Mosaic covenant is a covenant of grace, that God purchased a people by blood, brought them out of Egypt, and is bringing them to himself on eagle's wings through blood sacrifice and through Moses as a mediator who typifies Christ. Now, this critical view of pleasing God without grace, we've talked about before, but I just want to summarize it to put it in theological context so that we don't get bogged down by details. In the OPC report that we've referenced before, when we treat the taxonomy of views that are trying to explain the specific relation that the nation of Israel sustains to the Lord, there are two fundamental ways of understanding that relationship. One is that that relationship is an administration of the covenant of grace, that God is relating to Israel on the same principle by which he related to Adam after the fall, Noah after the fall, Abraham after the fall. So this is an organic and progressive extension of that gracious covenantal relation. The other view is that the national covenant is a substantial republication, not of the covenant of grace, not an extension of the covenant of grace, but a substantial republication of the covenant of works, meaning this, that either in a fundamental, foundational, republished way, the Mosaic covenant is the covenant of works, just a stark republication where salvation is offered for perfect, personal, exact, and entire obedience. Or there's a view that, according to our committee, and I stand by this, I think it's a helpful way to put it, a subservient covenant view, where it's not eternal salvation that the national covenant offers, devoid of grace. It's rather land retention that Israel can merit devoid of grace. And so the key there is that God requires always, and in all covenants, he requires perfect and personal and exact and entire obedience for all of his creatures. That's beyond dispute. But the issue is that on the critics' view and on the substantial republication of the covenant of works view, whether it's a pure republication or a subservient view that just tethers the obedience to land blessing, there is the possibility and actuality of pleasing God without redemptive grace. Now, the reason I preface it that way, Camden, is that Voss is now, beginning on page 267, he's going to take issue with the critical theory, and it's very much worth our time to consider this. This theory, in summary terms, is that the wilderness sojourn of Israel, when Israel is between Egypt and Mount Sinai for 40 years, that sacrifices, quote, were unnecessary for securing or obtaining the favor of the Lord. And this view coheres perfectly with the critic's Pelagian or Socinian anthropology, because God can look favorably upon a sinful people without the interposing of blood sacrifice, or without a sacrifice being given on their behalf. And so the Voss is going to be addressing that critical view that's going to look at certain texts among the prophets that seem to suggest God never even instituted a sacrificial system, that it's not of divine origin, and that God is not interested in blood sacrifice. And so it's a really interesting and important discussion, because it raises the question, can God relate favorably to a sinful people apart from blood sacrifice, apart from an atoning substitutionary sacrifice that cleanses and provides the basis for their acceptance before God? Typical in the Old Covenant, of course, climactic in the New Covenant, but is that possible? And do certain texts teach that? That's a fascinating question that Voss is addressing here. And we can get bogged down in the details, I think, and miss the gravity of this discussion. It's a really important one.